Welcome to this explainer. When we talk about early American colonization, everyone's mind immediately jumps to Jamestown or Plymouth. But you know what? Decades before those famous settlements even existed, European powers were trying and spectacularly failing to conquer the American Southeast. Today, we're diving right into the terrifying compounding factors that led to the absolute collapse of 3 early European settlements.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, the tragedy of San Miguel. Second, the sheer desperation at French Charles Fort. Third, the fall of Santa Elena. And finally, we'll pull it all together and look at exactly why these colonies collapsed.
All right, Part 1, the tragedy of San Miguel.
Let's jump back to 1526. Lucas Vázquez de Ayllón led a massive, ambitious expedition of 600 settlers, including missionaries and enslaved Africans, to set up the very first Spanish settlement in what is now South Carolina. But talk about a bad start. Almost the second they arrived, their primary supply vessel ran aground. Just like that, completely lost to the sea. They were instantly plunged into severe shortages before they could even unpack a single crate.
And this set off a shockingly rapid, tragic timeline. Right after losing those critical supplies, summer hit, bringing absolute swarms of mosquitoes. Malaria tore through the camp, killing tons of residents, including Ayllón himself. So now they have no supplies and no leader. Then winter rolls in with extreme cold, and starvation sets in, pushing the survivors to do whatever it took just to stay alive.
To put this absolute disaster into perspective, just look at this staggering fatality rate, 75%. Yeah, by the time the few survivors finally abandoned the site, fleeing on these desperate makeshift rafts, only 1/4 of the original 600 settlers were left alive. In just a few months, 450 people had died. It's truly mind-boggling.
But it wasn't just the disease and the freezing weather. What literally sealed their fate was a devastating triple threat of violence. The whole settlement essentially caved in on itself under the crushing pressure of internal Spanish mutinies, defensive attacks from the local Native American tribes they were encroaching on, and uprisings from the enslaved Africans they had forced to come with them. Just a complete top-to-bottom institutional failure.
Moving right along to Section 2, Desperation at French Charles Fort.
Fast forward to 1562, and we have the story of 150 men whose colony failed thanks to some truly terrible planning and massive leadership gaps. This was supposed to be a permanent haven for French Huguenots on Paris Island, but it was abandoned in less than a year. Why? Because they were literally abandoned by their own leader. The guy in charge, Ribaud, sailed off to get more supplies, but wound up getting trapped back in France by a religious war.
What happens next is horrifyingly procedural. The settlers wrongly assumed Ribault would be back any minute, so they just didn't plant any crops. When winter hit, surprise, there was no local food and no supply ships on the horizon. The starvation got so bad that the desperate men mutinied and actually murdered their local commander. Finally, they managed to cobble together this clumsy makeshift boat for a disastrous ocean retreat. And honestly, this journey was so terrible that the survivors actually resorted to cannibalism before an English ship finally rescued them.
Actually, what's really wild is the sheer level of desperation before they even got on that boat. To stave off the winter starvation while still at the fort, these men were literally boiling and eating their own leather shoes and jackets. It perfectly highlights how hopelessly unprepared they were for this environment.
Okay, let's look at our third case study, Section 3, the fall of Santa Elena.
Now, Santa Elena was no small pop-up camp. Established in 1566 near present-day Port Royal, South Carolina, this was intended to be a permanent Spanish foothold. In fact, during its second settlement phase starting in 1577, it peaked at over 300 residents. It was the actual capital of La Florida. We're talking a church, a tavern, 40 houses, the whole shebang. Yet despite being this important political hub, it was entirely abandoned by 1587. It was essentially squeezed to death by a vicious combination of internal struggles and external military threats.
It was basically a two-front war for survival. On the ground locally, the soil quality was awful, leading to agricultural failure, so starving Spanish soldiers started raiding local Native Americans for food. Tension skyrocketed, the Spanish executed native chiefs, and violent retaliation naturally followed. Meanwhile, on a global scale, English privateers, most notably Sir Francis Drake, were actively attacking nearby St. Augustine. This made Santa Helena incredibly vulnerable militarily, ultimately forcing Spain to cut their losses, strategically consolidate their forces down in St. Augustine, and abandon Santa Helena for good.
But we really need to look closer at that local tension, because it's what initially broke the colony's back.
In 1576, those escalating hostilities over the food raids and executions exploded into the Guale and Arista uprising. 500 tribal members descended on the Spanish. They killed over half the station's soldiers and completely burned the settlement to the ground. That massive uprising actually forced the first major evacuation of the site before the Spanish foolishly tried to return a year later.
Which brings us to our final section, why the colonies collapsed.
When we look at the big picture of everything we've just discussed, we can see three undeniable pillars of failure across the board. First up, environmental hostility. Whether we're talking malaria at San Miguel, brutal winter starvation at Charlesfort, or garbage soil at Santa Elena, none of these groups respected the harshness of the local environment. Second, leadership and planning. Ayllón died, Ribald stranded his men without crops, and Santa Elena's leaders completely failed at basic diplomacy. And third, perhaps the biggest one, local conflict. Every single one of these colonies suffered severe internal mutinies or devastating pushback from the native populations they were exploiting. Fundamentally, they failed because they totally misunderstood the realities of the land, the preparation required, and the people who were already living there.
Which leaves us with a pretty haunting question to chew on as we wrap up this explainer. Considering the starvation, the boiling of leather shoes, the mutinies, the diseases, and the absolute total devastation we just explored, what could possibly compel the next wave of European explorers to willingly step back onto those ships and try again? Thanks for exploring these doomed colonies with me, and always keep questioning the history we think we know.